Welcome to class, everyone. My name is Dr. Clejo. I'll be guiding you through a series of lectures on testing and assessment. Today will be an introduction of language assessment. So here are the things that we'll cover today. We'll look at definitions of test versus assessment, approaches to testing. So we'll be comparing different types of testing. We'll also look at different types of tests by their purposes and characteristics of good tests. So we'll look at some characteristics that make a test a good test. Okay, let's have a look at definitions of test and assessment to begin with. So if we have a look at this diagram here, we see the large circle that says teaching, and within that large circle, we see a smaller or inner circle called assessment. So assessment, as you can see, is a part of teaching, and it's embedded in classroom tasks that are designed to elicit performance without recording results and making fixed judgments about a student's performance. And within assessment, there is another smaller circle here called test. A test is a subset of assessment. It's a method of measuring a person's ability, knowledge, or performance in a given domain. Okay. You can see here 8 pairs of different types of testing. So we see formative versus summative, direct versus indirect, norm-referenced versus criterion-referenced, standardized versus non-standardized tests, discrete versus integrative, traditional versus alternative, competence versus performance, and finally, paper-based versus computer-based. We'll look at 4 of these pairs today. We'll look at formative versus summative, norm-referenced versus criterion-referenced, standardized versus non-standardized, and discrete versus integrative. Okay, so let's compare these 2 types first, formative versus summative. The goal of a formative test is to help students to learn and practice. It's given several times during an instructional unit, so there can be, let's say, 3 formative tests or even 10 formative tests. So we give formative tests to identify gaps in knowledge and to improve learning. So the goal is to help identify gaps in students' knowledge so we can support their learning process rather than to evaluate their performance for assessment. And how do we administer formative tests? Via approaches that support specific student needs. So some major examples of formative tests would be quizzes that teachers often give out to students, homework, worksheets, or projects. Now let's have a look at this column here, summative. The goal of a summative test is to assess students' performance, and it's usually given at the end of the term, year, or semester to make sure that the students understood everything covered in the particular unit or course. And it collects evidence of student knowledge, skill, or proficiency. And how do we administer summative tests? Via exit learning products or cumulative assessment. Okay, so some examples would be final papers, final exams to make sure that students accomplished the objectives of the particular course. Okay, next pair, norm versus criterion referenced tests. So the definition of norm reference test, or let's just call it NRT, is to compare individual results to the results of other children or other students. So the scores are relative. They're given in terms of percentiles, where you are compared to other test takers or students. And what it measures is general language abilities or proficiencies. And some examples would be language assessments that we are familiar with, TOEFL and SAT. Now, criterion reference test, or if we want to shorten it, CRT. It is designed to compare results to predetermined criteria instead of comparing the performance to other test takers. The score is given as an absolute score in terms of percentages rather than percentiles. And it measures specific objective-based language points. An example would be a chapter test. Okay, let's have a look at non-standardized tests. Under the overarching term of achievement test, we see standardized versus non-standardized test. So it's non-standardized because it's not one of the major ones. It's not something that has been standardized, but it's something that's designed by the teacher. Okay, and within non-standardized tests, we can also see different types. Written, oral, or even practical. And if we just concentrate on written type, we can also subdivide written tests in terms of essay types, short answers, and objective types. Okay, now let's compare discrete point versus integrative test. So the definition of a discrete point test is that it tests only one element at a time. So it could be a specific language skill, such as listening, reading, speaking, or writing. So for example, a multiple choice question on a particular grammatical point. Now, let's compare discrete point to integrative test. An integrative test tests several skills at the same time. So it could be, for example, listening and writing combined. Or it could be reading something, then answering in speech. So an example would be a dictation question, writing a summary while listening to a lecture. Okay, let's now look at some different types of tests by their different purposes. Okay, so the first one we have here is diagnostic test. It identifies strength and weakness for remediation. So an example would be a diagnostic reading assessment to make sure the student can read at a sufficient level. Next type is placement test, designed to assess students' ability in order to place them in a course. So for example, a level test in order to enroll in an ESL course. Achievement test, which measures the progress towards a language course objective. So for example, a final term test. There are also proficiency tests, which assess overall capability of a person in language irrespective of level. So it doesn't matter whether you're a beginning learner, intermediate, or advanced learner. So some examples of proficiency tests would be TOEFL or TOEIC. And finally, aptitude tests, such as the SAT, which assesses someone's ability to learn a language, how capable they are in learning a language. Okay, here comes a very important part. So this could be your burning question. What makes a test a good test? Let's have a look at some characteristics of a good test. according to Dorobat, these are some general principles that we have to remember in order to design a good assessment. Assessment is not an end in itself, but a vehicle for educational improvement. Assessment is most effective when it reflects an understanding of learning as multidimensional, integrative, and something that's revealed over time. Assessment should reflect that learning is a complex process. It involves knowledge, values, attitudes, habits of mind that affect both academic success and performance in real life. So, as you can see, assessment is a very complex concept. And it's not a simple, straightforward process as we might want it to be sometimes. Okay, and now let's have a look at Brown's definition of a good test. Let's have a look at these characteristics of a good test in terms of these 5 elements: validity, reliability, practicality, authenticity, and backwash. Okay, validity. So validity means that the test should adequately measure what it's supposed to measure. In other words, it has to be accurate. It has to be able to accurately measure what it's supposed to measure. A testee's or test taker's score gives a true reflection of his or her ability on the trait. And statistical and descriptive means have been used to check validity. Now, reliability. Reliability refers to the consistency of scores or answers from one administration of an instrument to another, or from one set of items to another. So what it means is that if a teacher gave the same test to the same student, the results should be similar. They should not vary too much from one time to another. Reliability is a requirement for validity. In other words, in order for a test to be in order to be valid, the test should be reliable first. So a test is not valid unless it can first meet the conditions of reliability. So just remember this. Reliability, check. If it passes, then check validity. Okay, 4 factors that may affect reliability. Let's have a look at these 4 elements. First, test length. We have to make sure that the test is not too long or too short. Distribution of scores. We have to make sure that the scores are distributed in this way, making a nice bell curve. The level of difficulty. The test should not be too difficult or too easy, which would not serve its purpose. And objectivity. Okay, and in terms of practicality, is the test easy to prepare, use, interpret, and store? All right, so let's have a look at these 4 different elements. We have to make sure that the test is not too expensive. If it's too expensive, then teachers and students will not be able to afford it. Appropriate time, duration. It's not, like we said before, it shouldn't be too long or too short. It should be easy to administer. And you should have a specific and effective scoring procedure as well. All right, authenticity. It can mean the degree of closeness of the test tasks to the real-life tasks in the target language. So what it means is that the test items should be authentic, or that it reflects real-life tasks or real-life conditions. Let's have a look at this pair of examples. We have here a bad example and then a good example. So let's see why the first one is a bad example. Why it's not authentic. Okay, so this is a fill-in-the-blank question. Colorless green ideas blank furiously. So grammatically, the first one, sleep, should be correct. But if we say sleep here, let's see if the sentence makes sense. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Yes, it's grammatical, but does that make sense? Semantically, it does not make sense at all. What does it mean? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, let's have a look at a good example that's authentic or something that reflects real-life circumstances or tasks. Here is another fill-in-the-blank question. Life is always a rich and steady time when you're waiting blank, something to happen or to hatch. And we're given these two options. Should we put in for or in? The correct answer, of course, is for. Life is always a rich and steady time when you're waiting for something to happen or to hatch. Grammatically, yes, this sentence is correct. And semantically, does it make sense? Yes. Life is always rich and steady when you're waiting for something to happen or hatch. Yes, so it's a sentence that we would actually use in real life. So this is a good example because it's authentic and semantically correct as well. All right, let's also look at backwash. You can either say backwash or washback. These two terms are used interchangeably. So what it means is that a test affects participants, processes, and products in teaching and learning. So a good test should have a positive influence on the teaching and learning leading up to the test. Okay, so according to Bachman, who's an expert of language assessment, positive washback occurs when the assessment used reflects the skills and content taught in the classroom. The test can be positive effect of backwash if the test can make students pay more attention to the lesson, so a positive effect, and prepare more about it. So we see this as a positive effect of backwash if the test can actually motivate students to concentrate harder or to work harder and to thoroughly prepare for the test. Okay, now let's have a look at some more examples of positive versus negative backwash. Okay, an example of a positive backwash would be since a speaking test score has been required as a job application document, the average speaking skills of university students have been increasing. Yeah, with TOEIC, for example, because students or applicants need to submit the scores from a speaking test, such as the TOEIC speaking test, their speaking skills have been improving. So it's great result or positive effect of backwash or washback. Now, some examples of negative backwash. TOEIC scores, however, don't necessarily guarantee English skills. So Korea's exam-driven education system doesn't do much to help students to actually use English. Just because you did well on TOEIC doesn't mean that you are fluent in English or that you have high level of skills in all areas of English. Another example would be this. It's hard for students to focus on speaking or writing because these two skills are often not tested. So for example, on college entrance exam, Korean SAT or 수능, because speaking and writing are not tested, students have very low motivation in many cases to learn these particular skills that are not tested on the college entrance exam or 수능. Okay, Here are some review questions. Compare the difference between the formative and the summative assessment. Do you remember the differences between the two types of assessments? Compare the difference between the norm referenced, we decide to call it NLT, right? And the criterion referenced assessment, or CRT. And can you also list the qualities of a good test? If you can answer these 3 review questions without too much difficulty, then you understood everything that we covered in today's lesson. Okay, and here are references that were used in today's lesson. And that's it. That concludes our introduction to language assessment. Thank you, and well done you.